So, when we talk about war and conflict, we love clean endings. The battle is won, the treaty is signed, the enemy surrenders. But as we've seen throughout history, it's actually a different story. Wars don't end when the shooting stops, they end when the fighters stop seeing violence as their best option. And that's the part we get wrong again and again and again. So we here in the United States are great at winning wars, but we're actually pretty terrible at ending them. Because ending a war doesn't mean defeating an enemy. It means that you make sure that they don't come back. And yet, time and time again, we ignore what happens next in the conflict. So we talk about counterterrorism, stabilizing fragile states, cutting off the flow of weapons and funding, but we fail to ask what I'm arguing is the most important question. What happens to these fighters after the war? Because if we leave them unemployed, hunted, and isolated, we're not ending a war. We're just pressing pause on the next one. So before I start talking a little bit more about the Red Sea and the Horn of Africa, I'm going to invite you with me into the jungles of Colombia to start with. And I want to present to you Manuel. So Manuel was the kind of person who believed in second chances, even when the world refused to give him one. I met Manuel in 2014 in this housing settlement that you can see at the edge of the Colombian Amazon, where I lived for 15 months between that year and 2016. And it was a place where the government barely existed. There was no reliable electricity, there was no water, no police presence, no military presence. It was mostly governed by militias and FARC factions and just full of people trying to survive, trying to rebuild their lives after decades of war. So Manuel had already been running for his life, really, for 2 years when I met him there, but he'd actually been running for a long time before that. So when he was just a teenager, the military killed his brother. They called him a guerrilla. He wasn't. But in that moment, it didn't matter in Colombian history. The government had decided that he was the enemy. And in that time, when the government decides you're the enemy, there's actually only one ending to that story. So Manuel went to the only place that would take him, the FARC, or the Revolutionary Armed Forces of Colombia, which is a Marxist-Leninist guerrilla group that at its height was about 30,000 members strong. They did demobilize formally in 2016, and there's quite a long story after that as well. But Manuel had spent years as a guerrilla fighter and eventually became a commander in his unit on the north on the border with Venezuela. But he was captured by the army in a week-long manhunt that really put some of these Hollywood depictions to shame. And after his capture and subsequent holding by the military, he decided he wanted a different life. He demobilized in 2011, long before the peace agreement. And at that time, it meant that there was no protection for him as a former member of the FARC. There was no guarantees, certainly no political backing. And it meant that the FARC had marked him for death under what was called their Plan Pistola. So that was their systematic campaign to execute any who defected from the ranks or their family members. But Manuel believed at that point that peace had to be possible. He went through the government's formal reintegration program, and by the time that I met him, he was in the last few years of what was typically a 7-year stretch. And despite all odds, he wasn't just surviving, he was actually trying to heal his community in the process. He worked for the only outside organization that had a presence in our community, which was an NGO helping victims and ex-combatants reconcile, even though it paid almost nothing. He was passionate about learning community psychology, about rebuilding the social fabric that the war had torn apart, and he spent his days sitting with the victims of the very group he had been in and inviting his fellow ex-combatants to participate, mediating and listening, and helping to find ways for people to live together again. But in this context, redemption is dangerous work. Manuel wasn't just a former guerrilla, he was a former guerrilla who refused to pick up a gun again. And that made him a threat, not just to his old commanders, but also to the right-wing paramilitaries and local violence entrepreneurs like microcriminal enterprises or drug trafficking operations. And while I lived there, I watched him fight for almost 2 years to get the government to protect him in the way that he was legally entitled to. And what was his reward for all of that work? He got an old secondhand bulletproof vest that spent most of its time hanging on the wall. No armed escort, as the law had dictated, no relocation funds, just a worn out vest against a network of enemies who wanted him dead. And for 10 years, he held on. 10 years he spent working on the margins, trying to do things the right way, trying to prove that peace was possible, and then came the offer, the same one that had been coming to him for years. But this time, though, he felt like he didn't have anything to stand on in order to turn it down. The Sinaloa cartel had been expanding their presence in the region rapidly following the signing of the 2016 peace accord, and the governance vacuums that the implementation flaws of that peace accord had opened up had left behind in their wake a power vacuum. And the Sinaloa cartel was very much taking advantage, is still taking advantage of that power vacuum. And they were looking for people with local credibility. They needed somebody who understood the local power dynamics and somebody that knew how to lead. Manuel had spent this last period of his life, over a decade, trying to build a better future. But in the end, the only ones that were willing and able to offer him a way forward weren't the government, weren't the peace builders, weren't the people who cared to claim about stability and peace. It was a Mexican drug cartel. And this time, after several years of them approaching him, he finally said yes. Not as a soldier, not as an enforcer, but as a politician. He won the local elections. He is now in government with power and authority befitting his station, and he is in direct debt to the Sinaloa cartel, the cartel that finally gave him a future. So that was in October of 2023, and it has been a journey that has been profoundly painful to follow. Now let me tell you about Arturo. Like Manuel, Arturo was a committed revolutionary. He wasn't drawn to the FARC, though, out of survival or retribution. He actually joined as an ideologue. He had gone to university in Cartagena in Colombia and studied Marxist-Leninist theory. He believed in the promise that it offered for a new society, one where power wasn't hoarded, where corruption didn't shape the future, and where the people at the bottom actually had a say, which is the root cause of many years of discord in Colombia. So he chose to go to war, convinced that the FARC was a mechanism for justice. And then reality hit him. Arturo quickly saw that the textbooks hadn't prepared him for the hypocrisy of these armed groups. The FARC's leaders lived well, better than they had ever let on. Their tents had more supplies, their meals were bigger, they had more women, they drank when the soldiers were not permitted to, and their lives were not at risk in the same way as the foot soldiers who fought in the jungle against the right-wing paramilitaries and the army, and who were surviving on the bare minimum. The classless utopia that he had envisioned didn't exist. But the moment that broke him had nothing to do with politics. It was a child, a young recruit who was about 12 years old and who died in his arms, bleeding out during a firefight with the military. Arturo had joined the guerrilla for ideology, but when he saw that boy die in his arms and take his last breath, he realized that this revolution was eating its own. So he left, he ran, he escaped the group. But unlike Manuel, he got a chance to walk a different path. The government reintegration program, the same one that Manuel had been in, wasn't perfect, but it was enough. And when Arturo finished it, he was actually offered a job within that same program. And that one job, that one opportunity changed everything. It gave him an income, something desperately needed in all conflict-affected contexts worldwide. Still more importantly, it gave him, my research associate is walking across, sorry, come on, excuse me, something desperately needed. So more importantly, it gave him something the peace process rarely offers, which is a personal identity, a professional identity, beyond just being ex-FARC. Arturo learned how to mentor people like him, how to navigate institutions, how to manage programs, connect to donor streams. He built a network, and over time, he became the thing that had once felt impossible, a leader outside of armed struggle. Now, more than a decade later, Arturo runs his own NGO with another victim of the armed conflict whose aunt had been sequestered or kidnapped by the FARC. They leveraged their own personal process of reconciliation between them in order to heal the wounds of the past in their communities and prevent youth from taking the same path into violence and war. His focus? Preventing children from ever having to make the choice that the boy who died in his arms had to make. And through funding from organizations like UNICEF, he works across Colombia to stop recruitment into non-state armed groups. He helps children find a future before the war does. Two men, two former combatants from the same group, two indefatigable work ethics. One was given a viable path forward and one was not. That's the difference between reintegration that works and reintegration that fails. And if we're serious about security and stability, not just in Colombia, but across fragile states like Somalia, for example, we need to start asking the right question. What happens when the people that we call threats have nowhere else to go? So we often think about security in terms of military power, patrols, counterterrorism operations. But what if the real challenge isn't just about who we're fighting, but actually who we're leaving behind? What happened to Manuel is not just a Colombian story. It's not just a Latin American story. I've worked with these populations across 15 countries and 4 continents, and I can tell you this is a global security story. And Manuel's story isn't just a relic of Colombia's past. It's playing out in real time across the Red Sea right now and the Horn of Africa. In Somalia, a wave of former al-Shabaab fighters face no viable alternatives beyond recruitment into new militias or back into the group again. Piracy networks and other opportunities, besides what they need to actually effectively reintegrate into society. So we need to start thinking about the ways that we can work this into our security strategies rather than just disengage them and leave them behind. And so if fighters are left without pathways into economic and existential survival, we can see what happens. And that's what we're seeing play out throughout the region now. In Yemen, thousands of child soldiers from Ansar Allah, so commonly referred to, so though incorrectly, as the Houthis, will soon be defecting into a world without options, leaving them vulnerable to re-recruitment by armed groups, human trafficking networks, or regional proxy wars. In Ethiopia, fighters from the Tigray Defense Forces and the Amhara Fano militias, so young men who mobilized in the name of defense and survival, risk being left without economic or political futures, fueling inevitable new cycles of insurgency. In Sudan and South Sudan right now, the brutal war between the Sudanese armed forces and the RSF, the Rapid Support Forces, is creating an entire generation of combatants with no off-ramp, many of whom will either continue fighting or be absorbed into the mercenary groups across Africa and the Middle East and globally. From Eritrea, ex-conscripts and army defectors are fleeing indefinite military conscription, but have nowhere to go and no legal status. So they are prime targets for smuggling networks, rebel groups, and organized crime. And in the waters of the Red Sea, piracy is reemerging as desperation drives young men to hijack ships instead of starving on land. This is the security crisis of our time. Not just the wars themselves, but what happens to the fighters after the war ends. We've seen this story before, and we know how it ends unless we change it. All of these groups share a common reality. Once you pick up a gun, putting it down is the hardest part. If fighters are left without pathways to survival, they will find another war to fight. They will be recruited into criminal and extremist networks, and that will fuel long-term global instability. The defection and reintegration of ex-combatants isn't just a question of human rights or peace building or humanitarianism. It's actually a security imperative. So what if we could turn some of our greatest security risks, these disengaged former combatants, into force multipliers for stability? That's what at stake is in Somalia. That's what's at stake in the Horn of Africa. And that's what you all, as future policymakers, as security and defense officials, soldiers, development practitioners, academics, consultants, advisors, that's what you will all have the opportunity to change. But to understand the stakes, we need to take a look at a country where the consequences of failing reintegration are unfolding in real time. And so that's why I'm going to bring you now to Somalia. So Somalia is a textbook case of what happens when fighters are given no viable alternative to war. For decades, the collapse of Somalia's government has left power vacuums that have fueled terrorism, piracy, and transnational organized crime, among other things. These aren't just local issues, as you read in your materials, which I'm sure you all read thoroughly and not in the 30 minutes before you started today. But these are actually issues that directly impact regional and global security, particularly Red Sea trade routes and strategic competition in the region. So right now, Somalia faces three core challenges that tie directly to the topic of reintegration and are keeping it locked as a nation in cycles of conflict, and regionally as well. First, the lack of economic alternatives. So defectors, for example, who leave al-Shabaab often find themselves jobless, without skills, without the means to support their families. And in these conditions, returning to an armed group isn't really a choice. It's about survival. There's also legal limbo and security risks. So those who defect live in constant fear for their lives. There are active programs to hunt down and kill defectors from al-Shabaab, and it's generally widespread knowledge where they tend to concentrate because of the location of government support programs. So both their former group and the security forces view them as threats rather than assets. And without clear protection, many regret leaving and return to violence unless they have those alternative pathways. And of course, there's this profound and well-deserved in some ways mistrust from local communities. So the stigma of being an ex-combatant really never fades. And that's something that's very difficult to, but absolutely necessary to address in every context worldwide. Many defectors struggle to reintegrate because communities do not trust them, leaving them on the margins of society with nowhere to go. They also fear from the physical attacks of reprisals that al-Shabaab might make on the communities through IEDs and things like that, attacking the former members of their group. But when reintegration fails, the consequences ripple beyond those communities, beyond those individuals, and beyond Somalia. Failed reintegration means that terrorist recruitment increases. Every fighter who defects and is left without options is a potential recruit waiting to happen for al-Shabaab or other new insurgencies. I actually just got off of a call yesterday from a former retired colonel in the Colombian army who shared with me the active recruitment that the Sudanese Rapid Support Forces are conducting in Colombia. And recently, there's been an estimate of about 300 Colombian military veterans thought to be participating or having already died in the war in Sudan. Somali piracy is resurging, threatening global trade, and without economic opportunities, piracy becomes the rational choice for survival, disrupting critical trade routes in the Red Sea and the Gulf of Aden. China, Iran, and Gulf states are exploiting this instability where reintegration fails and power vacuums form, and foreign actors are rushing in to fill in this gap, reshaping the security landscape in ways that challenge US and allied interests. So this isn't just a problem for Somalia. It's a regional and a global security crisis, but it is not an unsolvable one. So what if reintegration wasn't treated as an afterthought for maybe some humanitarian actor down the road? What if we stopped seeing these defectors as only security risks and actually started seeing them as potentially stability assets? So the question is no longer then whether reintegration should happen or it should be supported. It's actually whether we're going to act before it's too late. So now let's take a little bit of a deeper dive into the policies and failures and emerging opportunities that are currently shaping reintegration efforts in Somalia today. So as I've already alluded to, too often reintegration is treated as a humanitarian issue, something for NGOs and the development agencies and the do-gooders to handle after the real security work is done. So to look into this a little bit more, my team and I conducted over 250 interviews across 3 regions where former al-Shabaab members are most prevalent. This is research that's been going on for a little bit over than 3 years. We spoke with defectors, with community leaders, clan leaders, security officials, reintegration practitioners, international development officials, all of these stakeholders to understand what works, what fails, and what needs to change. And we found some pretty uniform conclusions about what needs to happen. First, reintegration isn't a charity, it's a strategy. So when it's done correctly, reintegration disrupts armed group recruitment pipelines, making it harder for insurgencies to replenish their ranks. Former fighters also aren't just liabilities, they're intelligence assets. I'm going to come back to that phrase in a second, so bear with me there. Many understand insurgent logistics, financing, and recruitment tactics, depending on what their level was when they were in the group. But their knowledge is rarely leveraged. Instead of treating them solely as threats, then maybe they could be partners in dismantling the networks that they once served. And economic reintegration, when done right, strengthens entire communities, so not just these individuals. When former combatants are economically reintegrated, the entire social fabric stabilizes. Programs like Combat to Commerce, which I'll explain to you in just a minute, prove that alternative economies can replace illicit ones. And here's the most important point. Reintegration doesn't just stop fighters from returning to the war that's happening now. It stops their younger brothers and their cousins and their sons from picking up a gun in the first place in the future. Now, when I say former fighters are intelligence assets, I'm going to go back to that phrase. I don't mean shining lights on people in dark basement rooms or blasting Britney Spears throughout detention centers. I don't mean interrogations or coercions or Jason Bourne style subterfuge. I mean real intelligence, the kind that actually prevents the next war. Because here's the truth. No one understands insurgencies better than the people who built them. And no one knows what it takes to leave that life behind them than the people who are in the middle of that journey right now. They know how recruitment works, who gets targeted, what messages land, what fears are exploited, and they seem more than happy to share that information under the right circumstances. How money moves, which informal markets fund operations, how it happens, which businesses act as fronts, which financial loopholes keep insurgencies alive, and also how attacks are planned, what vulnerabilities groups exploit, how they communicate, how they adapt under pressure. That's years and millions of dollars of research on the other opponent's side for something that a former combatant on a dignified and robust pathward towards sustainable reintegration may often be quite happy to share, as I've found in my own work. And yet in most reintegration programs, this knowledge goes completely untapped. So instead of treating former fighters solely as threats, what if we saw them as partners in dismantling these networks? What we did find is that when defectors trust the reintegration process, they voluntarily share critical insights that security forces would be very hard-pressed to get otherwise. Now, saying that they trust the reintegration process, that is no simple feat. There are a lot of reasons why they very much should not trust the reintegration process in many of these settings. But if they do, that is a power that cannot be replicated through simple investments in intelligence networks and private security alone. When they see a future outside of violence, when they truly believe that there is a future for themselves, that they can obtain a dignified life and what is so often foremost in their mind, which is providing for their families and trying to create a future for their children that's different from their own. So when they see that future, they are far more effective at preventing recruitment themselves organically than any government messaging campaign could ever be. So to me, it seems like the choice is really simple. I mean, we can ignore them, fear them, push them to the margins, and watch them get recruited back into war, this one or some other. Or we can engage them strategically, not as informants, not as criminals to interrogate, but as people who have lived inside the problem and now want to be part of the solution. That's the opportunity. And if we take it, we're not just reintegrating individuals, we are breaking the cycle of war itself. And that is something that no counterterrorism strategy, no military operation, and no government messaging campaign has ever been able to change. Because people don't join armed groups because of ideology alone. There's the occasional, person that comes to lead these groups, yes, but they join because of their relationships. even if those relationships are connected to the dissemination of a particular ideology. And oftentimes those relationships are family. So again and again in these 250 interviews, we heard the same story. My brother was already in. My cousin said that it was the best opportunity for a future. My father told me it was my duty. So this recruitment doesn't happen in a vacuum. It happens at the dinner table, in family courtyards, over tea, in WhatsApp groups, and through whispers between young men who feel trapped with no way out. And if brothers and cousins and fathers pull them in, guess who has the most power to pull them out? The same brothers and cousins and fathers. And that's what our research showed, that a young man who sees his older brothers successfully reintegrate is far less likely to join the armed group to begin with, and far more likely to leave it if he already has. A former fighter who walks away and survives, and maybe sees that the society outside of the group was not the one that the group leaders had told him existed, becomes living proof that another path exists, and that path isn't just prison or death. And that individual still talks to the people who are still in the groups through WhatsApp messages. They watch the same YouTube videos, leave comments in the same way, and that person can convince the others to leave the group. A father who once believed in the cause, but now see that the cause is actually the source of his child's own suffering, can become the strongest voice against recruitment in his community. And that's why reintegration is more powerful than military strategy alone, right? You need both. So you can drop leaflets, you can run radio ads, you can deliver speeches about the dangers of extremism. And I think folks that have worked in this field and been a part of this project have spent more time sharing about the foibles of these approaches and the ways that they didn't work than the ways that they have been successful. Not entirely, but in large part. But no one is more effective at preventing recruitment than somebody that was already inside, as I said, and it's not a theory. We've seen it work. So in the places where reintegration programs are actually trusted, where defectors are given a real alternative, we're seeing something different. Young men are choosing not to join in the first place. Families are choosing to protect their sons instead of sacrificing them. Communities are choosing stability over cycles of violence. So if we're serious about security building, we need to stop thinking about reintegration as just a moral obligation, or just giving fighters a second chance, or cutting off the supply of potential infidels. It's actually about cutting off the supply of future fighters altogether, and that is the real security building strategy. So I'm going to speak just very briefly about a project where all of this theory and all of this research and practice actually worked. So in our research, we uncovered key success factors that have allowed reintegration to work, even in the most fragile environments. There's a lot of nuance and vulnerability and differentiation that would need to be added to this, depending on which context you're talking about. But in general, local leadership is essential. That's what we found. Reintegration programs in Somalia in particular that involve clan elders, religious leaders, and community gatekeepers see higher participation and lower recidivism rates. Because without local buy-in, especially in clan-based societies, defectors remain isolated, making them vulnerable to re-recruitment or simply assassination by al-Shabaab. We did see that former fighters can become stability enablers. So we met defectors who had successfully reintegrated and later mediated local conflicts, reduced violence, prevented new recruits from joining armed groups. There was actually a very successful mentoring program that helped a lot with sort of the reorientation around religiousness and the practice of religion that helped to also keep people on the path. And one defector that we interviewed actually helped to convince 5 others from his old unit to leave al-Shabaab, which was a direct security impact that no military strike could have achieved. Alternative economies as well reduce the pool of armed groups. Former combatants need more than just amnesty, they need livelihoods. And this is true everywhere, from former special operators coming out of the GWAT, reintegrating into a society that doesn't have sort of the right fit of jobs for their extraordinary skill sets, or doesn't see their skill sets in a way that's legible to the opportunities that are out there, to a former member of al-Shabaab in Somalia, with the only option potentially being going in on buying a tuk-tuk to be a taxi driver, but not having enough capital to do so. The economic reintegration component is completely insufficient on its own, but absolutely fundamental to any successful pathway forward. So right now we see these fighters as nothing more than a risk. We ignore them. They'll probably return to war, but there's really an opportunity, I think, to engage them strategically, and that's what our research has shown. And this is not just a Somalia problem. This is not just a Horn of Africa problem. This is a crisis with direct consequences for global trade, energy security, and military strategy. So, for example, the Bab el-Mandab Strait, again, which was in your reading, is one of the world's most strategic choke points. And it is now at the center of an escalating security crisis as piracy, terrorist threats, geopolitical competition all intersect with one another. So we've already seen Somalia's instability spilling out over into the maritime space through threats, piracy, and regional destabilization. And if we fail to act on reintegration, that crisis is only going to deepen. So let me be clear, this is not about some kind of abstract, vague future risk. This is already happening. We are already seeing fighters, smugglers, and criminal networks exploiting instability to expand their reach into Red Sea shipping lanes. And every time we allow another generation of former fighters to be abandoned, we fuel new security threats, not just on land, but at sea. And while we focus on counterterrorism operations, other global actors are already thinking ahead. So if the West fails to engage in sustainable reintegration strategies, we are contributing to the ongoing creation and replication of these power vacuums that China, Iran, and Gulf states are more than happy to fill. China is expanding its security footprint in the Horn of Africa, as you saw in your readings, strengthening military ties, base presence, and increasing investment in regional infrastructures, its preferred way of wooing international partners, ensuring that it has leverage over critical maritime resources. Iran is vastly exploiting the instability in Yemen and Somalia to expand its own influence, fueling proxy conflicts, strengthening armed groups, and deepening instability along the Bab al-Mandab. And in the Gulf states, particularly UAE and Saudi Arabia, they're investing heavily in security and infrastructure, positioning themselves as a primary regional power brokers. And meanwhile, the US and its allies have been reacting rather than leading in this space. So where do we go from here? This isn't just about preventing a failed state. It's about building sustainable solutions that stabilize an entire region. No small task. So here's what that means. First, investing in reintegration as a fundamental pillar of a security strategy. Second, embedding reintegration efforts in economic development programs. Third, bringing the private sector into the conversation. Donors and investors must recognize that the instability in Somalia is not a humanitarian crisis alone. It is that, but it's a financial risk. If the Bab el-Mandab Strait becomes a no-go zone for shipping, the global economy will feel the impact. And then finally, strengthening regional partnerships. This is tough. In every region in the world, it is very difficult to get all of the state actors to work together for a variety of reasons. But in this case, as in all cases, really, they need to be coordinated. In this region across Somalia, Ethiopia, Sudan, Yemen, and the broader Horn of Africa to ensure that fighters don't simply migrate from one conflict to another, of which there are many to choose from in the region. And if we fail to act, we will watch another generation of fighters cycle through conflict after conflict, destabilizing the region and undermining global security. But if we engage now and treat reintegration as a security asset rather than a humanitarian expense, we can disrupt recruitment pipelines, prevent piracy, strengthen regional economies, and stabilize one of the most strategically vital maritime corridors on the planet. Now, how do we turn this sort of abstract, sure, you have to do this kind of strategy into action? So I spent a long time researching on these threats and developing counterterrorism operations and airstrikes and how those work and treating security as a problem to be neutralized. And we already sort of know, collectively what doesn't work. Just the killer capture strategy that ignores what happens after war, counterterrorism approaches that leave reintegration as an afterthought, and the failure to disrupt recruitment or prevent recruitment pipelines at the source. So what we did actually was pilot and test an approach to this. We've worked in every industry that touches on this topic of reintegration worldwide, and we sort of saw the strengths and weaknesses of each and tried to create something that addressed that, which was really the genesis of the Institute. So the approach is built on two key principles: radical participation and zero waste philosophy. So the participatory element just means that the people that are most affected by the conflict and whatever it is you're trying to do, so the ex-combatants, the victims, the community leaders, they aren't just beneficiaries of reintegration programs, just sort of passive recipients of international aid. They actually design them, they run them, and they decide what works and what doesn't. Reintegration does tend to fail when it's imposed from the outside and of a sort of one size fits all, I did this in Colombia, so surely it will work here kind of framework. It tends towards success when it's driven by those who have lived the experience. And the zero waste philosophy is referring to the assurance that nothing, no resource, no insight, no opportunity is squandered. Every intervention is designed for maximum impact with minimal waste of financial capital and political will. Funding goes directly to what works. Time is spent on solutions and not bureaucracy, and data is used to refine and adapt in real time. So great for the donors, but actually the origins of this mandate of ours came from observing so many instances in which millions of dollars were spent on interventions that served no discernible utility for the community. And one of the most powerful examples of this sort of framework, it's what we call the combat to commerce framework, is from Colombia. And this was actually the pilot test where we worked with former FARC. It was a small rural community that had families of former FARC, military veterans, and conflict victims who actually had come together and decided to work together to carve out a path forward through hydroponic farming. So they had previously been cultivating coca crops, the ingredient for cocaine production. They had joined the government program for crop substitution, burned all of the coca crops, but then the government never returned with the substitutions that they were supposed to have. And so they were really living in a condition of poverty and destitution. So we made about a $12,000 investment just to build a hydroponics agriculture project. It trained them with what they needed to know about how to do it, connected them with private sector and governmental partners. And we actually found that about 18 months later, they've reduced water use by 35%. They have increased their economic stability or the income of the community by 158%. Women have taken on 58% of the leadership roles. And the most important outcome, I think, is that these communities are now managing their own local governance structures, and they're reducing conflict and increasing trust in economic alternatives. So I've just want to emphasize that, this is actually a security strategy. So I've been notified that we're at time. I'm just going to offer a closing thought. Just what does this all mean for you, basically? I mean, why does reintegration in Somalia matter for me? I'm sitting in Chicago, sort of barely warm from the snow outside, and I have these visions for my future. So whether you're here today as a policymaker in training, a strategist, a future investor, or aspiring military leader, the decisions that we make about reintegration will shape the security landscape you operate in globally. And if we do nothing, we're guaranteeing that our adversaries, whether terrorist groups, transnational criminal organizations, or strategic competitors, will dictate the future of the Horn of Africa and beyond. But if we act, we seize an opportunity to turn a known risk into a security asset. So you came here today to think strategically and to tackle global security challenges. And I'm asking you to take this moment to think creatively about solutions that don't just contain problems, but transform them. The cycle of war won't break itself, and doing what we've done so far hasn't changed the equation. So the question will be, will we continue to react to conflict, Or will we have the courage to transform the very conditions that fuel it? The choice is ours, the choice is yours, and I invite you to join me in building the foundations for lasting security and peace. Thank you.